All right, I am very excited to talk about commodities crops today, which is not a usual topic of conversation. So I'm just going to go ahead and let Zach lead the way. An old system that you guys are really doing a nice new take on. It's regenerative, but it's based in old practices, and I think that's my favorite. So Zach, take me a little bit through why you guys have been grazing commodities crops. What are the benefits? And tell me about all the success you guys have been having. So you went from a conventional family background to just really doing a lot of change in Oklahoma.
Yeah, thanks for having us on, Lauren. We appreciate it. Appreciate you and appreciate what you guys are doing for all of us farmers. A lot of times in the regenerative space, and my wife and I are regenerative farmers, we don't use any pesticides, herbicides, any tillage, and we are multi-species. We use cover crops on all of our annual farmland, which is all dryland crops. And we farm on about 1,500 acres in southwest Oklahoma right now, and manage some land for a few different tenants. And so my wife's family has been farming in the area since 1908, and they're a very traditional commodity program. And in the regenerative space, the word commodity is kind of looked at as a dirty word because it has all these different layers that we understand to be negative and have a very negative impact on us as the people who are eating the end product, on the farmers, on the plant life, on the soil biology, all these different things. And so what I'd like to do today is kind of remove some of that stigma and say that whatever we choose to grow on our farms, we have the opportunity to make it an excellent crop that is nutritious both for the soil microbes and for our own gut microbes. And so that's kind of the goal of what I'd like to communicate today. So one of the ways that we do commodity cropping, if we call it, is we like to graze cattle on winter annuals. And we typically start planting those winter annuals, which down here in Southwest Oklahoma, and everything that I'm talking about needs to be regionalized to Southwest Oklahoma. If you're in a different part of the country, even if you're on a farm 5 miles away from me, your soil type could be different. The way that you plant things could be different. How you graze it could be different. And so I would just ask that anyone who hears this today just takes all that into their own context and adapts it instead of just taking this as like, this is what I'm telling you to do. That's not what I'm trying to do. So we utilize ultra high density cattle grazing of cow calf, which is just cows and their calves, and then stockers, which is buying lightweight cattle and putting weight gain on them either to use for beef or to sell to other customers who want a grass fed animal. And we do this on our native pastures, which is what's pictured here, by moving them anywhere from 2 to 6 times per day, or on our annual plants, which are on dryland farm, which would be typically for us wheat or rye with vetch or clover or all kinds of different things that we put into a cover crop mix. Turnip, radish, we usually do a 5-way mix on our annuals. So winter annuals in particular, which is like wheat, we'll just use wheat as an example, have a life cycle that's very interesting, in particular to people who are looking for somewhere to graze cattle and have good gains. We have the beginning stages of a plant, which is where it's sending out its tillers into the ground, trying to pull that moisture up and the nutrients. And so this area right here on the left-hand side of your screen is the beginning of the plant, and the end of the plant life cycle is where you have wheat and you can harvest the wheat. And that's what most farmers typically do. But in this middle section here, again, just talking about wheat, we have an area that before the grain heads out, which we don't call anything that we graze. We don't graze anything typically on wheat heads that have come out, and particularly not anything that we would sell as grass finished. That's not a grass finished animal to be grazing the actual grain off of the stem. And so this area here, before the grain has even come out of the boot, is what we're talking about. Now, wheat and other annual plants have what's called a vernal period. And the vernal period is a section of time where the plant isn't going to send up its grain, and it's typically requires it to be cold. And by cold, I mean like under 40 degrees for a certain amount of time. And so the plant isn't dormant because it's still growing, but it needs a certain amount of time in the vernal period, which is that cold stretch from like November to March, where we are, for the plant to be able to take in those nutrients, make sure that it will be ready come March, April, May to grow and sprout that grain. And so this middle stretch right here is what we're talking about grazing. The timeline for us here We typically plant this week. We're talking on September, is it the 3rd today? I think it's the 3rd.
Yeah.
That's the 3rd. So I start planting on the 5th. And we typically start planting, and it takes us, we have about 500 acres of cover crops that we plant for annual forage in the wintertime. I start planting now, and that might go until November 15th. And then you would typically give that plant some time to grow up so that you're not just like eating the nub that's just barely come up, that's just germinated. So we give that plant some time to grow. And sometime in the middle of November into the middle of December, we will typically put cattle on that wheat and rotationally graze them. Now, you might think that since we're putting cattle on a commodity crop like wheat or rye, or really any kind of commodity crop you can plant, oats, um, that it might damage the plant. But because of that vernal period where the plant is somewhat dormant and isn't sending up the grain yet, you have until the plant develops the grain sprout in the bottom of the plant that then comes up through the plant. We call that hollow stem, which I can explain later. But you have that whole stretch of time, which for us is November through about March 15th, where you can graze the plant without grain on it, and it does not impact your ability to harvest that plant. Now, that is regionally specific for North Texas, Oklahoma, some areas of Kansas and Nebraska. You have the ability to do this. And there are some other parts of the country you can do it as well, but that's where it's done most commonly. And so we typically would pull our cattle off of the commodity crop fields, which again, commodity crop fields to us are mixed cover crop fields, but we just use a commodity cover, which is wheat, to be able to use insurance, to have access to all of these ways we can mitigate our risks as farmers at scale. So we pull the cattle off on March 15th, and then the plant sends up its grain sometime in the middle of April, typically, and that's where we start to see those seed heads come to the top, like a typical grass plant, because wheat is a grass plant. And then in June, we're able to harvest. So
I have a question real quick. I'm going to
yeah,
cut you off.
yeah.
So you guys are using rotational grazing practices. Does this also work for non-rotational grazing? If somebody has a giant field and they let them out, tell me a little bit rotation versus non-rotation.
Yeah, great question. So we use pretty intense rotational grazing even on our wheat fields, just because that's what we like for the best soil health and animal health. But a lot of people do this with what we would call set stocking or continuous stocking rate. And one of the ways you can really utilize something like this is if you have a small patch, let's say like 5-10 acres, where you could plant some wheat or some rye or whatever winter annual you wanted, you can use it as a protein supplement and let your animals, you can limit graze your animals on that wheat or rye. Or like a lot of people will have a deer plot where they have like 5 acres of like clover and whatever. And you can limit graze your cattle or sheep or goats, whatever you want to do, out on those winter annuals for like an hour a day. And that will give them the protein supplement that they need, because these winter annuals are very high in protein, for them to go back to native grasses or hay or something else, instead of using something like alfalfa hay or cubes or alfalfa cubes, or a protein supplement like urea or something else. And so it's a good question. So there's all kinds of different ways you can use it. You can set stock on it, you can rotationally graze on it, or you can limit graze on it. All of those things are possible until we get that grain, which is the hollow stem during the jointing period of the winter annual, starting to come up. And then you need to pull your livestock off if you want to harvest. Now, a lot of people just graze out the wheat or the rye or the triticale or whatever it is, and they don't worry about harvesting. But
Would
for
that
us,
just be a different termination method that some people would use?
it would be a great termination method. And for cows that we're not butchering, we will actually put them on fields that we're graze out, that are not going to harvest. Cows are like an awesome vacuum cleaner for your farm. They're the garbage disposal, right? Because what makes the grain bad isn't like planting of the grain, it's all the things that go onto it, all the things that man has put onto it. And cattle eat seeds all the time. If you ever walk out into a field in the middle of July, August, you will see seed heads. Now, grain seed heads are not something we would ever want to feed our cattle. We aren't a grain finishing operation. We don't use grain in our operation, but we think it's perfectly acceptable for cows as part of a mixed forage base, right? Because it's not just wheat out there. We've got clover, we've got turnips, we've got radish, we've got native grasses coming up through, something we call hoorah grass here in Oklahoma that pops up. I don't even know what the scientific term for it is, but all those things are available to the cattle. And so we will use cows that we're not planning on butchering as kind of the vacuum cleaners to clean up those fields and get them ready for our summer cover crop, which we would then graze again. We think that's the best way to make sure all of the nutrients are recycled. We're reducing our fertilizer costs because of the manure and urine that's being put out onto that field by cows rotating around it. Alan Williams and everybody with understanding ag, one of their core tenets is that you integrate livestock on everything. And we really believe firmly in that in everything that we do, we want to integrate livestock, and we want to use livestock for what they're good at, which is consuming forage and putting that waste, which is not waste, back on the land so that we get to use it again, and the soil biology continues to recycle itself.
I like it. I'm trying to look at different avenues for people, right? Like terminating other things. So if people didn't mind grain finishing, though, is that a nutritional thing that, so basically if it's a rye field, it's a high grain, we would just have to make sure the diversified diet of the cow is there. But what if people did not mind grain finish? Do you have a...
If you don't mind grain finishing, then that would be perfectly fine. I would argue for the cow, it's way more healthy to be eating it off the stalk or whatever you're finishing, to be eating it off the stalk in combination with other things growing in the field, right? Than being stripped, cleaned, put into a trough, and fed that way. I don't think cows should ever eat like that.
And economically too, right? There's like 10,000 steps you just skip for it.
Yeah, so if you're using any kind of commodity crop or grain or cereal grain or corn, anything, and you're okay with grain finishing or selling an animal that's been eating grain like that, then it's a great way to do it. And I think it gives the cow a much more diverse diet and it really drops your expenses significantly if that's how you choose to do things. Now, we don't choose to grain finish, and that's why we pull our cattle off on March 15th or roundabouts, because we don't want anything that's being finished to eat that grain off the seed head that's from a commodity crop. But if you don't have an issue with that, I think a much healthier way and a more holistic way for your cow to actually get their nutritional requirements and eat some of those seeds. So one of the things that caused us to originally look at this is the economics of it. The economics of growing winter wheat, we'll just use as our example here, on 160 acres. And so on the left-hand side here, we have farming on 160 acres. This is our seed cost per acre, $32 is what I would estimate. We keep some of our own seeds, so our cost might be a little lower than this. I'm just using kind of general numbers that you could go find on the marketplace. To have somebody no-till drill, we have a drill, but if you had somebody no-till drill it right now in our county, that cost is $22 an acre. Insurance, which we think is an important way for us to mitigate, and one of the reasons why we do this is we're in a severe drought right now, and if a crop doesn't come up, we're not going to lose all of our money. And so operating with commodities gives you a lot of flexibility. You will never make money insurance farming. And I am very anti-insurance farming. There's a lot of people that will just put a seed in the ground and then till it over as soon as they cash their insurance check. And that's not what I'm arguing for here. I'm arguing for reasonable risk mitigation, which I think is an extremely important thing for anybody who wants to farm full time, which is what we are doing. We're doing this full time. This is how we get our income. So it's a reasonable thing for us to say, we want to make sure when we're spending down there $143 an acre, that if we have a crop failure, we can recoup some of that cost and we're not out that money. So these are all the costs you'd have associated with it. You can see the total cost to put this crop in if we yield 18 bushels per acre, and our total crop cost per acre to get it in and harvest it, including the lease cost, but not including our labor costs or our overhead. This is just kind of gross product here. You would expect the current spot price for next July, which would be the futures market, is $7.18 per bushel. You would expect on 160 acres to make $20,000. Now, that's less than we spent. And so you can start to see why doing some enterprise stacking on top of these things is important to farmers. Now, we also sell beef and we sell pork and we sell wheat and we sell flour. So what I'm doing here is just describing to you how somebody could build a business based around the commodity market, but also be regenerative and have access to good insurance and have access to markets that can mean you don't have to put as much time and energy into it. So if we add cattle, and I'm just using custom grazing cattle, which is someone else who owns the cattle that pays you in this situation per pound that they gain on your farm, which would be typical of wheat pasture in our region. The same 160 acres could take 60 head very conservatively for 90 days. That's just 3 months, right? From like December to March or from November to late February. And you'd expect them to gain between 2 and 2.5 pounds a day. Each animal would gain 172 pounds, you'd get paid 85 cents per pound. That's the market price per pound right now. And so your gross profit on that enterprise, which is stacking on top of your wheat, would be $8,700. And so if you combine both enterprises, you can see that instead of losing $2,000 on commodity farming or not having something for cattle to graze over the wintertime, you have something that can be really beneficial for the farmer. And for regenerative farmers in particular, who are interested in cycling those nutrients in the wintertime, when other grasses might be dormant, it's a really lovely alternative to just putting something in the ground and not integrating animals, is to have something you can graze for that time period. So that's kind of the reason why we integrate commodity crops. We also harvest and sell the wheat, and we're not really tied to the $7.18 number, right? Because we're regenerative and we get to add value to all of our product and we get to add value to our beef. This example is strictly if you were looking at this from a commodity lens, which is how we like to start looking at things and then see how we can upgrade it, if that makes sense.
Do you mind kind of walking us through what a regenerative market versus the commodities market is a little different, since you've been on both sides? Any kind of pros and cons around that space or where it's headed?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting space because regenerative farming is clearly something that's caught on. And while it's still niche, there's going to be demand for it. We're already seeing it from big companies now. The greenwashing that will occur to the regenerative space is something all of us should be concerned about. But the only thing we can really control is how we're choosing to produce these goods. And if we're producing them at a high ethical and moral standard that we feel good about, and that fits what we're telling our consumer, which is no pesticides, no herbicides, no tillage, animal integration, and always keeping alive root in the ground, so that those soil microbes are continually feeding on something, then we have the capacity as regenerative farmers to do this at large scale. And we're doing it, I would consider, we're not exactly large scale, but compared to some other regenerative farmers, 1,500 acres is a little bit more and less than quite a few. But like, we have the ability to grow commodity crops using regenerative practices. And even if we sold everything into the commodity market, because our regenerative practices make biological sense, we're saving money on inputs and profitable because of that. Now, the market itself is something I think if we build it, they will come. But there's not a whole lot of people doing regenerative crops, commodity crops at scale right now. And that's part of why we're so excited about it, is because we think there's a lot of opportunity there moving forward. Anybody who's interested in this kind of thing, it doesn't take even 160 acres to do any of this. It could be 5 acres, it could be 10 acres, it could be 10,000 acres. It's all possible. It just depends on how you want to structure it. And it's a great option that I don't think most people know, that you can graze wheat or rye or triticale or clover, whatever you choose to plant for your winter annual, in November and graze it with their livestock, sheep, cattle, goats, chickens. Chickens do great on a winter annual when they have that extra green over the winter. So anyway, we're really passionate about it and feel like the word commodity really kind of gets a bad rap, because we have control of what we're producing. And if we want to produce the cleanest, best wheat that we want, that's a really wonderful product. And the market wants it right now, and that's what we're seeing.
I've got a 10-minute timer because I'm on my free Zoom for some reason. Do you mind going back and hitting what the high level benefits of it are? Like, did you do fertilizer reduction? Did you do, have you had improved yields? If you don't mind just kind of hitting your top 3, top 10.
Yeah, I would say the best thing that's happened is that we are seeing more native and volunteer species coming up, which fill in the gaps that were on these fields that were pretty degraded before we took them over. And so our total yield, which when I'm talking about total yield, I'm talking about like the amount of forage being produced per acre, has definitely gone up significantly. And we know that by using GIS models and DBI. Like, we can go and check on our soil forage maps how those things are improving over time. And what we're seeing is the soil temperature has decreased in the summertime because we have residual plant matter left there from the winter. Our cattle are being integrated, which means we have increased amounts of fertility. It's never going to be exactly the same as putting down nitrogen. Like, we can't expect that. It's going to be little pockets here and there, but the combined biological activity of that many hooves in that small of an area, eating, defecating, peeing, increases the cycling of nutrients in that area and reduces your need for inputs. And so our yields are competitive, they're low, but like when we actually go to harvest our grain, it's not like we're harvesting the same amount that other people are harvesting in the area. If we chose to put down fertilizer, we would be, but we just don't. So our yields are reduced because of that, but the actual gross product that we produce, like the amount of beef that we can raise on an acre per year, which is what we're really measuring this by, is significantly higher. So you have increased fertility, increased plant matter, and then increased profits because you get to use that acre for more, for basically 365 days instead of your 180-day growing season.
Do you feel like with the trajectory you're on that you might get to more competitive levels, or how is your trajectory going? Because you guys are how many years in at this point and very
Yeah,
new?
5 years in, and we've only really been doing commodity covers for the last 3 years. And so we've had 2 harvests on some of those fields because 3 years ago we would have been planting at this time, and next June we would be harvesting our third. And so we've seen them go up. But our concern isn't really like the bushel yield on the wheat. And so I'm concerned about it. Concerned is the right word. I care about my yields because I want to make some money off of the wheat harvest. But as we saw on the financial and economics slide, the bulk of our income is going to come not just from the wheat, but from grazing cattle on it, not just for 90 days, because I'm putting a lot more cattle than 60 on 160 acres. So I'm seeing the trajectory go up on our yields, and I'm seeing that biological activity continue to increase those yields. But I'm more concerned with the amount of forage than the actual grain yield, which is a slightly different thing. They're correlated, but not exactly. And so I'm more concerned with the grazing of it than the actual harvest. And the harvest is just like a really nice bonus at the end of the year to say, oh, that paid for all my expenses, and now my income is coming from the cattle that I was able to graze for an extra 180 days because we planted that winter.
That makes sense. Yeah. Awesome. All right. I think we covered it all. Anything before I turn it off? Because I think you nailed it.
No, I appreciate the chance to talk about it.